Tommy DeSimone was one of those names that carried weight in the underworld of New York during the 1960s and 70s. To the outside world he might not have been a household name, but inside the circles of the Lucchese crime family, his reputation was one of danger, unpredictability, and sheer ruthlessness. He was the man who would inspire Joe Pesci's chilling yet oddly charismatic portrayal of Tommy DeVito in Martin Scorsese's classic film Goodfellas. That character was brash, funny, charming, but also violent and psychotic, capable of switching from laughter to murder in a heartbeat. The reality, in truth, was even darker, because the real Tommy DeSimone was not just a violent gangster, he was a ticking time bomb, feared even by other feared men. Thomas DeSimone was born in Brooklyn in 1950, into a family already tied deeply into organized crime. The DeSimone family had long-standing connections to the Mafia, particularly the Lucchese crime family. Tommy's grandfather and uncle were both involved in mob activities, and it seemed natural that Tommy would eventually be pulled into that life. He was tall, around 6 feet 2, which made him stand out in contrast to the much shorter Joe Pesci who would later portray his character on screen. But unlike the small man with the big temper in the film, the real Tommy was a physically imposing figure who carried himself like someone who understood that intimidation was as useful a weapon as a gun or a knife. He became close to Henry Hill and Jimmy Burke, two names that would become infamous after Nicholas Pileggi's Wiseguy and its film adaptation Goodfellas. Henry Hill, who later turned informant and revealed the secrets of that world, described Tommy as a complete psycho. The stories about him always seemed to circle back to the same traits: unpredictable, violent, dangerous, and someone you never wanted to cross or even joke with the wrong way. While many mobsters lived by a certain set of rules, however warped those rules might seem, Tommy had a way of breaking them simply because of his impulses. The most famous story that exemplifies his personality is the one dramatized in Goodfellas, the "funny how" scene. In the movie, Joe Pesci's Tommy explodes at Henry Hill when Henry innocently laughs and says, "You're funny." For a tense moment, it seems like Tommy will kill Henry right there at the table for disrespect. While the movie version was dramatized, it was rooted in truth. Henry Hill himself said that Tommy really was like that. You could never joke with him, because he might take it the wrong way and then suddenly you were in a fight for your life. He could turn a light-hearted moment into a deadly confrontation in a blink. Tommy's reputation for murder was legendary. He wasn't just a killer, he enjoyed killing. Hill once said that Tommy had killed at least 10 people that he knew of personally, though the real number might have been higher. Some of these murders became infamous in mob history. One of the earliest and most notable was the killing of Billy Batts, a made man in the Gambino family. This murder alone sealed Tommy's fate, though he might not have realized it at the time. Billy Batts, whose real name was William Bentvena, had recently been released from prison. He crossed paths with Tommy at the Sweet, a bar owned by Henry Hill. Batts jokingly told Tommy to go back to shining shoes, a reference to Tommy's younger days. That small insult was enough to enrage DeSimone. Later that night, with Jimmy Burke's encouragement, Tommy attacked Batts savagely, pistol whipping and kicking him nearly to death before Burke and DeSimone shoved him into the trunk of a car. When Batts made noises from inside the trunk, Tommy opened it and stabbed him repeatedly before they finally disposed of the body. The problem was that Batts was a made man, and in Mafia culture, killing a made man without permission was an unforgivable sin. Even though the Lucchese family had protected Tommy for a while, his fate was sealed the moment he laid hands on Batts. But that wasn't the only violent incident that built Tommy's reputation. Another killing that stood out was the murder of Michael Spider Jonko, a young bartender who worked at a card game run by Jimmy Burke. Spider was only 19 years old, just a kid trying to make his way around dangerous men. One night, Spider forgot to bring Tommy a drink. Tommy, feeling disrespected, shot him in the foot. Instead of apologizing or trying to make amends, Tommy turned the whole thing into a twisted joke. At another card game not long after, Spider showed up with a cast on his foot. He was teased by the others, but he didn't take any nonsense, even telling Tommy to "go fuck yourself" after being pushed around. That defiance was the end for him. Tommy pulled out his gun and shot Spider dead in front of everyone. Even Jimmy Burke, who usually laughed at Tommy's antics, was stunned, asking him what the hell was wrong with him. Henry Hill would later say that Spider's murder wasn't even necessary, it was pure impulse, pure bloodlust, and it showed just how unhinged Tommy really was. Another killing attributed to DeSimone was that of Ronald Foxy Jarrod, the brother of a woman DeSimone was dating. Apparently, Jarrod had made some kind of disrespectful remark or had an issue with Tommy. That was all it took. Tommy shot him in the face without hesitation. Once again, it wasn't about money, power, or even mafia business. It was simply about ego and temper. And this is what made Tommy DeSimone both useful and dangerous to his associates. On one hand, his willingness to kill without hesitation made him an effective enforcer and someone you could count on when you needed fear instilled in others. On the other hand, his uncontrollable temper and lack of discipline meant that he was constantly putting everyone around him at risk. The Mafia thrived on a kind of balance between fear and control, but Tommy leaned too far into chaos. He didn't always understand when to pull back, when to let things go, when to play the long game. Still, for a time, Tommy thrived. Alongside Jimmy Burke and Henry Hill, he was involved in some of the most lucrative crimes of the 1970s. Burke was the mastermind of many heists, and Tommy was often the muscle that ensured they went smoothly. The most famous of these, of course, was the Lufthansa heist at John F. Kennedy International Airport in 1978. The job netted nearly $6 million in cash and jewels, making it one of the biggest heists in American history. Though Tommy wasn't one of the key planners, he was certainly in the orbit of Burke and the crew that pulled it off. Henry Hill later revealed that Tommy killed one of the men involved in the heist, Parnell Stacks Edwards, because Stacks had failed to dispose of the getaway van properly. Once again, it was Tommy who carried out the murder, cold and efficient. But the Lufthansa heist also marked the beginning of the end for many of those involved. The authorities cracked down hard, and Burke, paranoid that people would talk, began eliminating anyone who might be a liability. Tommy, meanwhile, was still a wild card, and his past sins were catching up with him. The killing of Billy Batts, in particular, could not be ignored. The Gambino family had bided their time, waiting for the right opportunity to settle the score. That opportunity came in 1979. Tommy had been told he was going to be initiated formally into the Lucchese crime family. This was something every gangster dreamed of. It meant protection, status, and untouchable authority within the mafia world. Tommy was excited, proud, and ready for what he thought would be the crowning moment of his criminal career. But it was a lie. Instead of being inducted, Tommy was lured to a location under the pretense of the ceremony. There, he was executed. His body was never found, but Henry Hill later said that he had been shot in the head, and that it was the Gambino family's revenge for killing Billy Batts. Even Burke and Hill, who were no strangers to violence themselves, were shaken when they realized Tommy had been set up and killed. Burke reportedly broke down crying when he heard the news, not only because he lost his close associate but because he knew that Tommy's death was inevitable. He had become too reckless, too dangerous, and his own violent impulses had finally caught up with him. Tommy's story, while brutal, is also a window into the nature of organized crime during that era. The Mafia wasn't about senseless violence, despite what movies often show. It was about money, control, and respect. Violence was a tool, but it was supposed to be calculated, purposeful. Tommy broke that code again and again, killing people not for business but because of insults, slights, or his own anger. In a world where loyalty and discipline were prized, his lack of restraint made him a liability. And in the Mafia, liabilities do not last long. The reason Tommy DeSimone's legacy looms so large, however, is not just because of his crimes, but because of how he was immortalized in Goodfellas. Joe Pesci's performance won an Academy Award, and rightly so, because it captured the terrifying energy of someone who could be joking with you one second and murdering you the next. The funny how scene, the murder of Spider, the attack on Billy Batts, all of these were dramatizations of real events, real moments in Tommy's bloody career. And in many ways, Pesci's version of Tommy was more restrained than the real man. The real DeSimone was taller, more imposing, and perhaps even more frightening, because there was no movie camera to cut away from the aftermath of his violence. Henry Hill once summed it up by saying that Tommy was the kind of guy who scared even the most hardened gangsters. In a world of killers, he stood out as someone who actually enjoyed the act of killing. That made him useful in the short term, but doomed in the long run. His end was predictable, perhaps even inevitable, because men like him could not be controlled. They either burned out quickly, or they were taken out by their own people. When we look back at Tommy DeSimone's life, it is not a tale of glamour or success, despite how Hollywood sometimes romanticizes the Mafia. It is a story of wasted potential, of a young man born into a criminal world who chose the most violent path at every turn. He might have been remembered as a loyal soldier, a man who earned his place through discipline and service. Instead, he is remembered as a psycho killer, a man whose name still evokes fear and fascination decades after his death. His story is a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked violence, even in a world where violence was part of the job. Tommy DeSimone lived fast, killed without hesitation, and died young. He was only 28 or 29 when he was murdered, still in the prime of his life. But his legend endures, not because of honor or achievement, but because of the chilling way he embodied the darkest side of organized crime. When you watch Goodfellas and see Joe Pesci's character explode in sudden fits of violence, you're seeing just a glimpse of what the real Tommy was like. And when you hear Henry Hill's stories, you understand why men who killed for a living still shuddered when they talked about him. Tommy DeSimone's story is not one of heroism or even of clever criminality. It is the story of a man consumed by violence, undone by his own hand, and remembered as one of the most dangerous gangsters of his era.